Stop pouring. You skipped my row. Deborah Sinclair did not stop because she wanted to. She stopped because the man in seat 2A had spoken loud enough for every passenger in the first-class cabin of Meridian Sky Flight 444 summoned to hear him. And now 7 pairs of eyes were waiting to see what she would do next. She set the champagne bottle down on the cart, with a click that was too hard to be an accident, wiped her palm against her navy blazer as if she had touched something unclean, and looked at him the way you look at a stain you did not expect to find on a clean tablecloth. Sir, this service is for passengers who are actually seated in the cabin they paid for. I've seen your type before. Fake bookings. Stolen cards. I know exactly what this is. The cabin went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when everyone has just decided, at the exact same second, to look somewhere else. A woman 2 rows up, lowered her tablet an inch, and did not raise it again. A silver-haired man folded his newspaper along a crease that was already there. Elijah Marsh did not move. He did not reach for the boarding pass in his jacket pocket. He simply turned his head toward the window, where the wing lights blinked red against a sky the color of a fresh bruise over the plains of East Texas. And he said nothing at all. What Deborah Sinclair did not know was that her silence would cost her exactly 14 more minutes of feeling powerful, and then it would cost her everything else. Before we get to that moment, and I promise you, it is worth the wait, let me take you back 3 hours to a check-in counter in Houston, where a quiet man in a gray cotton sweater walked onto an airplane that he had built with his own 2 hands. Here is what you need to understand about George Bush Intercontinental Airport at 5 in the morning. It belongs, for 1 hour, to the people who actually run it, not the passengers, not the influencers filming their boarding process for an audience that will never see this hour. At 5 in the morning, Terminal E is quiet enough that you can hear the hum of the floor polishers 3 gates down and the low murmur of a ground crew supervisor calling out gate assignments over a radio clipped to her shoulder. It was into this hour, this quiet, unglamorous hour, that Elijah Marsh walked with a soft leather duffel bag over one shoulder and no rolling suitcase at all. He was 35 years old. He wore a gray crewneck sweater that had been washed enough times to lose its shape, dark jeans, and a pair of running shoes that had seen actual running. On his left wrist, a plain steel watch with a scratched crystal face and a leather band gone soft with age, the kind of watch nobody in a first-class cabin would look at twice. He walked up to the check-in counter without a printed reservation, without an assistant trailing 2 steps behind him, without any of the noise that usually surrounds a man who is about to be treated like he matters. He handed over his passport. He said 1 word, his name, and the woman behind the counter, a 26-year veteran of the airline named Carol Ibsen, felt her spine straighten before her brain had fully caught up with what her eyes had just read. Of course, Mr. Marsh. Seat 2A. Welcome aboard. She did not ask for a credit card. She did not ask him to confirm his frequent flyer number. Every employee at Meridian Sky Airlines had sat through the same onboarding video during their first week of training. A video that never used his face, only his name, printed once on a single slide. If Elijah Marsh checks in for a flight, you treat him the way you would treat the person who signs your paycheck, because he does. Elijah Marsh, 35 years old, Chief Executive Officer and majority shareholder of Meridian Sky Airlines, the youngest person in the airline's 91-year history to hold both titles at once. Fortune had profiled him twice. He had declined the cover photo both times. There was no verified social media account with his face on it. No red carpet appearance, no interview where he explained, in the careful language executives use, how a boy from a 2-bedroom apartment off Tidwell Road ended up owning an airline. His photograph existed in exactly 2 places on Earth: his employee identification badge and a single framed print hanging in a hallway outside the Meridian Sky boardroom in Lower Manhattan that most of the company's 14,000 employees had never had a reason to walk down. He liked it that way. There is a particular kind of information you can only get by becoming invisible, and Elijah had learned, over the last 2 years, exactly how valuable that information was. 11 times in 22 months, he had boarded his own airline's flights in worn sweaters and unremarkable shoes, sat in the seat a stranger would occupy, and simply watched. 9 of those flights had been flawless, crews who treated every passenger, famous or forgettable, with the same steady warmth. 1 flight had a baggage delay that cost a family their connection. Elijah had personally called the family 2 days later to apologize, and the airline had rebuilt its transfer protocol from the ground up. 1 flight had a gate agent who was short-tempered with an elderly passenger struggling with a boarding pass on her phone. That agent sat through 4 weeks of retraining and, 6 months later, was managing the gate herself with visible patience she had not had before. Flight 44-1 would be the 12th flight, and it would be the one he never forgot. He walked down the jet bridge carpet, past the smell of the cabin's signature scent, a blend of cedar and something faintly like rain that Elijah had personally approved during the airline's first-class relaunch 18 months earlier, back when his father was still alive to hear about it. Otis Marsh had worked the tarmac at this very airport for 31 years, loading bags onto belts in 98-degree heat and freezing sleet, and he had never once flown first class in his life. He had died 4 years ago of a heart condition. Nobody caught in time, because he had spent 3 decades believing that taking a sick day was a luxury reserved for other people. The watch on Elijah's wrist had been his father's. It still kept perfect time. The first-class cabin held 8 seats, cream leather, warm amber lighting designed to make everything look expensive without trying too hard. In seat 1A, a woman in a charcoal cashmere coat scrolled through a tablet without glancing up. In seat 3B, a silver-haired man in a gray wool suit had already unfolded the morning paper across his lap, a cup of black coffee balanced on the armrest with the precision of a man who had done this 10,000 times before. In row 4, a couple in matching travel blankets murmured about a dinner reservation in Manhattan they were hoping not to miss. Elijah slid into seat 2A, buckled his belt, and set his phone face down on the armrest. Across the narrow aisle, in seat 2C, sat a man who would matter more than anyone in that cabin realized. Walter Higgins was 71 years old, a retired federal appellate judge from Burlington, Vermont, with white hair combed back in a straight, disciplined line and reading glasses pushed low on his nose. He glanced up when Elijah sat down, gave a short nod of the kind 2 strangers exchange when neither one needs conversation, and returned to the paperback thriller open in his lap. The kind of book he could solve by chapter 4 and read anyway, because he liked being right. Then Deborah Sinclair stepped through the cabin curtain, and the entire tone of the space shifted half a degree. She had been a Meridian Sky flight attendant for 14 years, 9 of them in first class, and she wore that number the way some people wear a medal, carefully, publicly, and with the quiet expectation that you would notice it. Her navy blazer was pressed sharp enough to hold a crease you could cut paper with. Her name badge, gold-plated, had been polished that morning until it threw back the cabin lighting like a small mirror. She moved down the aisle greeting the woman in 1A by name, complimenting the silver-haired man's tie, telling the couple in row 4 their favorite Pinot Noir had been restocked just for this route. Then she reached row 2. Judge Higgins, always a pleasure, warm, genuine. Deborah meant it. Her eyes moved to seat 2A. The smile did not vanish. It simply changed temperature. The way a room changes temperature when a door opens somewhere you cannot see. What remained was polite enough to survive a glance from a supervisor and hollow enough that Walter Higgins, without meaning to, lowered his book 2 inches to watch it happen. Deborah gave Elijah a short nod. No name, no welcome. She moved on toward the galley, and Judge Higgins turned a page of his thriller without reading a single word on it. Watch that nod. It will come back later, in a very different room, in front of very different people. The aircraft pushed back from the gate at 6:14 a.m. Central Time, climbed out over the flat brown grid of Houston's northern suburbs, and leveled off at 36,000 feet, somewhere above the Arkansas border. 20 minutes into the flight, Deborah rolled the beverage cart out of the galley. 3 bottles of champagne, 7 flutes already set and gleaming on the top shelf. She started at row 1 with a smile, moved to row 3 with a laugh at something the silver-haired man said about the stock market, reached row 4, and told the couple their scarves were the exact same shade of camel, which delighted them. She reached row 2. Judge Higgins received his glass with a nod and a quiet word of thanks. Then she pushed the cart past 2A without slowing down, without a glance. The way you walk past a piece of furniture that has already been decided does not belong in the room. Elijah watched the pale gold liquid fill every glass in that cabin except his own. He raised one hand, and his voice, when it came, was calm in a way that made the calm itself feel dangerous. "Excuse me, I think you missed my row." That is the moment we started with. That is the moment Deborah Sinclair set the bottle down too hard, wiped her hand on her blazer, and told a man wearing his dead father's watch that she had seen his type before. What happened over the next 11 minutes was not one insult. It was 3, and each one was worse than the last, delivered by a woman who genuinely, completely believed she was protecting something. The first came almost gently, almost forgivable, the kind of moment a nervous bystander could talk themselves into explaining away. "I just need to confirm your booking, sir. That's all." Standard procedure. Except it was not standard procedure. Deborah had not asked the silver-haired man in 3B to confirm his booking. She had not asked the couple in row 4. Judge Higgins noticed this. He said nothing. He told himself, in the particular language people use to excuse their own silence, that it was not his place to interrupt a flight attendant doing her job. The second insult came louder, and it came in front of everyone. Deborah planted herself in the aisle, hands on her hips, and raised her voice enough that the couple in row 4 stopped their conversation about dinner reservations entirely. "I have flown this route for 9 years. I know exactly what a legitimate first-class passenger looks like. And sir, respectfully, you are not it. Do you have any idea how many people try to sneak into this cabin with a stolen boarding pass? I've seen it a dozen times. You people always think you can talk your way into something that isn't yours." The words landed in the cabin like a dropped glass. Nobody moved. The woman in 1A set her tablet down entirely. Priya Anand, a management consultant in seat 3A, who had boarded this flight 40 minutes earlier, thinking about nothing more dramatic than a client presentation in New York, felt her thumb hover over the record button on her phone screen. She did not press it yet. Fear has its own weight, and hers held her hand still for exactly 9 more seconds. Elijah reached into his jacket and produced his boarding pass, holding it out without a word. Deborah snatched it from his fingers, glanced at it for less than a second, and threw it back into his lap. Anyone can print a fake one of these at home. I'm calling this up to the cockpit. If Captain Reeves wants to have you escorted off at JFK, that's exactly what's going to happen. That was the 3rd tier, and it was the one that could not be walked back. A threat made in front of 6 witnesses to have a paying passenger removed from an aircraft based on nothing but a feeling Deborah Sinclair had decided to trust more than the document in her own hand. She turned and walked toward the intercom, mounted near the galley wall, lifted the handset, and in a voice pitched to Carrie, requested that the captain be advised of a possible security concern in seat 2A. Elijah did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He did something far more unsettling to everyone watching. He reached into his other pocket, took out a plain black government-issued phone that looked nothing like the phone he had set on the armrest earlier, and made a single call. 90 seconds. That was all it took. He said 4 sentences into the phone, listened for 11 seconds, said thank you, and hung up. Then he set the phone face down again and looked out the window at the clouds, as if nothing at all had happened. Priya Anand pressed record. She would tell people afterward that she had never been more frightened to do something so small. Her hands were shaking hard enough that the first 11 seconds of footage came out blurred, and she had to press her elbow into the armrest to hold the frame steady. But she kept filming, because somewhere underneath the fear was a colder, clearer thought. If she did not have proof of this moment, nobody watching from the ground would ever believe it had happened exactly this way. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a room right before something breaks, and it fell now. The engine noise did not change. The cabin lights did not flicker, but every person in that space felt the air go thin, the way it does in the seconds before a verdict is read. Deborah Sinclair stood in the aisle, with the phone handset still warm in her palm, waiting for a response from the cockpit that she assumed would validate everything she had just done. It did not. The cockpit door opened 4 minutes later, which on an aircraft is an eternity. First Officer Danielle Ruiz stepped out, walked directly past Deborah without a word, and crouched beside seat 2A. Mr. Marsh, Captain Reeves apologizes for the delay. He's been in contact with Manhattan operations. He asked me to let you know directly that everything is being handled. The words fell into the cabin like a stone into still water, and the ripples reached every seat. Judge Higgins lowered his book entirely now, no longer pretending to read. The woman in 1A turned fully around in her seat. Deborah Sinclair's mouth opened, then closed, because Mr. Marsh was not a name she recognized, and the tone in which the first officer had said it was not a tone flight cruise used with ordinary passengers, no matter how loudly they complained. "I'm sorry," Deborah said, and her voice had lost its certainty for the first time in 11 minutes. Handled. Handled how? Who authorized? She did not get to finish the sentence, because Captain Alan Reeves himself stepped out of the cockpit, something he had done exactly twice in his 19-year career, both times for emergencies. He walked down the narrow aisle, stopped beside row 2, and addressed the cabin in a voice that was quiet and absolutely certain of itself. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption to your flight. I want to introduce you to a passenger some of you may not recognize. This is Elijah Marsh, Chief Executive Officer and majority owner of Meridian Sky Airlines." The cabin did not gasp. It did something quieter and heavier than that. It went completely, perfectly still. Deborah Sinclair's face drained of color in a way that had nothing to do with the cabin lighting. Judge Higgins set his book down on the armrest entirely, folded his hands, and watched with the stillness of a man who had spent 4 decades on the bench, learning exactly how to watch a moment like this unfold without missing a single second of it. "That's not possible," Deborah said, and her voice cracked slightly on the second word. "There's no photo. Nobody told us. Nobody was supposed to," Captain Reeves said. That was the point. Here is what almost nobody in that cabin knew, and what Priya Anand's shaking camera would soon make impossible for anyone to unknow. This was not the first complaint filed against Deborah Sinclair. Meridian Sky's internal HR system had flagged her file twice before, both times for incidents involving passengers of color in first class. Both times closed without action because the passengers involved had not filmed anything, had not had a company owner sitting across the aisle, and had simply gone home and carried the humiliation somewhere nobody could see it. Deborah did not know that Elijah's team already knew this. She was about to find out. Deborah Sinclair did not apologize. This is the detail that matters more than any other detail in this story, because it tells you exactly who she was underneath 14 years of pressed uniforms and polished name badges. She stood in that aisle, in front of the man who owned the airline she worked for, and she said, "I was protecting this cabin. I've seen scams before. I was doing my job." "You were doing your job," Elijah said, and it was the first full sentence he had spoken since the beverage cart passed him by. His voice was still calm the way a held breath is calm. "Your job was to pour a glass of champagne for a man who had a valid boarding pass in his hand. Instead, you decided in front of 6 strangers that the color of my skin told you everything you needed to know about whether I belonged in this seat. That was not your job. That was you." Nobody in that cabin spoke. Priya Anand kept filming, her hands finally steady. Judge Higgins, 71 years old, a man who had spent 40 years believing his silence in a courtroom meant something different than his silence on an airplane, cleared his throat and said the only thing he would say the entire flight. "I watched her do it to the last passenger in this seat 6 months ago. I didn't say anything then either. I'm saying something now." Deborah's eyes moved to him, and something in her face cracked for just a moment. Not remorse, not yet, but the particular panic of a person realizing the story they have told themselves about who they are is about to be contradicted by every single witness in the room. Behind the galley curtain, a second flight attendant named Trevor Doyle stood frozen with a tray of empty glasses in his hands, watching everything and saying nothing, the way he had said nothing. 11 months earlier, when Deborah refused to reseat an elderly passenger with a service dog, and the way he had said nothing 4 months before that, when she made a comment about a family speaking Spanish in row 3 loud enough for them to hear. Trevor had told himself, each time, that it was not his place. He was learning, in real time, that there is no such thing as not your place when you are standing 3 feet away with a tray in your hands. A third crew member, Renee Castillo, stood further back near the coffee station. And she did something small that nobody else in the galley did. 15 minutes earlier, before any of this had escalated, she had quietly filled a glass of water and set it on the counter near Elijah's row, not as a statement, just as a small kindness offered to a man who looked like he might need one. She never got the chance to bring it out. It sat there, sweating condensation onto the counter, the entire time the cabin held its breath. The remaining 3 hours of the flight passed in a silence that had texture to it. Not peace, but the aftermath of a storm still visible on everyone's face. Deborah retreated to the galley and did not come out again, except to complete her mandatory safety duties. Trevor took over cabin service, his hands unsteady enough that he spilled coffee on the tray twice. The woman in 1A eventually approached Elijah's row quietly and said, "Only, I'm sorry that happened to you," which was more than anyone else in that cabin managed to say out loud, though several of them would think about saying it for years afterward. Judge Higgins spoke once more, near the end of the flight, leaning slightly across the aisle. "I've spent 40 years watching people decide, in a fraction of a second, who deserves respect and who doesn't. I have never seen someone handle that decision being made against them with more restraint than you just did. I don't think restraint is the right response, for what it's worth. I think it's just the response you've been forced to learn." Elijah looked at him for a long moment. "My father worked on that tarmac for 31 years, he said quietly, tapping the scratched face of his watch. This was his. He never got to sit in a seat like this. I built this airline so nobody else's father would have to wonder if he was allowed to." Flight 441 touched down at John F. Kennedy International Airport at 11:52 a.m. Eastern Time. The wheels hit the runway with the ordinary shudder of any landing, but nothing about what waited on the tarmac was ordinary. Through the cockpit windshield, Captain R. Reeves could already see 2 black SUVs parked near the jet bridge, and standing beside them, 4 people who had been dispatched from Meridian Sky's Manhattan headquarters the moment the in-flight call from Elijah's black government-style phone had gone through. 2 from Human Resources, 2 from the legal department, none of them smiling. Deborah Sinclair was instructed to deplane first. She walked down the jet bridge with her blazer still pressed, her name badge still catching the fluorescent light, and her spine held in the particular rigid line of someone determined not to let her face show what her body already knew. The HR director, a woman named Patterson, with a tablet held against her chest like a shield, was waiting at the end. Miss Sinclair, your employment with Meridian Sky Airlines is terminated effective immediately. Please surrender your identification and crew badge. Deborah's fingers trembled as she unclipped the gold badge she had polished every morning. For 14 years, the badge she had used, more than once, to remind people exactly how long she had worked this cabin. She placed it in Patterson's open palm. It made almost no sound at all, and somehow that silence was louder than any argument she could have made. I was protecting the standard of this cabin, Deborah said, one final time, to nobody in particular, because there was nobody left who wanted to hear it. Nobody answered her. Trevor Doyle, walking 2 steps behind her, was informed that his employment was also terminated for participating in and failing to intervene in a documented pattern of discriminatory conduct, despite 2 prior warnings in his file. He did not argue. He simply handed over his badge and looked, for the first time all day, like a man who understood exactly how he had gotten there. Renee Castillo was the last of the 3 to be addressed. Patterson reviewed her tablet, looked up, and said something none of the others expected. Miss Castillo, your file shows you attempted to quietly de-escalate the situation prior to the incident, and you did not participate in the discriminatory conduct. You'll be placed on a mandatory retraining track. But your position is not being terminated. Renee nodded once, unable to speak, and for the first time since the flight took off, she allowed herself to cry, not from fear of losing her job, but from the particular grief of having watched something terrible happen and done almost nothing to stop it. Judge Higgins passed Deborah on the jet bridge without a word, but he slowed for just a second, long enough for her to feel the full weight of his silence, which said more than any sentence could have. Priya Anand stopped in front of her, held up her phone, and played back 6 minutes and 18 seconds of footage. Every wiped armrest, every accusation, every torn glance, then put the phone away and walked on without a single word of her own. Elijah Marsh was the last passenger to leave the aircraft. He stepped onto the jet bridge in the same gray sweater he had boarded in, his father's watch still ticking quietly on his wrist. The Human Resources Director began to speak. He raised one hand. Not tonight. Full review, my office, Monday 9 a.m. He walked past the black SUVs, through the terminal, out to a plain sedan waiting at the curb, and was gone before most of the deplaning passengers had even reached baggage claim. The footage went online 3 days later. Not from Elijah's team, from Priya Anand herself, who posted it with a caption that read simply, "This happened on a commercial flight today. I don't think people should get away with this anymore." Within 48 hours, it had crossed 6 million views. Within a week, the story had a name that trended for 11 straight days. The Champagne Cabin. News outlets ran it. Aviation industry newsletters ran it. Deborah Sinclair's face, frozen mid-sentence in a paused frame, appeared on screens in airports she used to work in. 2 weeks after the flight, Meridian Sky Airlines announced a company-wide policy overhaul, mandatory anti-discrimination training for all 14,000 employees, an independent review board for any complaint involving a first-class passenger, and a new anonymous reporting line named, quietly and without press fanfare, the Otis line. After a baggage handler nobody outside the company had ever heard of, and everybody inside it would now be required to remember. The announcement never mentioned Flight 44, Swan said, by name. It never needed to. Everyone who read it knew exactly which flight had made it necessary, and exactly whose name belonged at the center of it. 6 weeks after that, the airline's internal review uncovered what the 2 earlier, ignored complaints had already suggested. A pattern going back nearly 4 years. At least 5 other passengers who had experienced some version of what happened to Elijah in seat 2A, none of whom had ever been believed, none of whom had ever had a company owner sitting across the aisle from them. Meridian Sky reached out to each of them personally. 2 declined to speak with the airline at all. 3 accepted an apology that came 4 years too late but arrived anyway. Judge Walter Higgins wrote a letter, 2 pages, blue ink on plain cream stationery, and mailed it to Meridian Sky's headquarters, addressed to Elijah Marsh personally. It ended with an invitation to dinner at his home outside Burlington, a small house on a quiet street where he still read legal thrillers on the porch every morning with a cup of black coffee. Elijah accepted. They ate roast chicken. They drank red wine, not champagne, and talked for 3 hours about the law. About the particular exhaustion of watching injustice happen slowly enough that you convince yourself it is not really happening at all, and about the difference between the two. 4 months after Flight 4417, Elijah Marsh walked, unannounced, and in the same gray sweater, into a break room at George Bush Intercontinental Airport, where the ground crew ate their lunch between shifts. Nobody recognized him at first. He sat down at an empty table, opened a thermos, and quietly asked one of the baggage handlers, a young man named Marcus, who had been working the tarmac for 8 months, what the worst part of the job was. Marcus told him honestly, the heat, mostly, and how invisible you feel to the people whose bags you're carrying. Elijah nodded, said nothing about who he was, finished his coffee, and left. It was not until 3 weeks later, when Marcus saw a photograph in a company newsletter, that he realized who had been sitting across from him. Nobody filmed that moment. Nobody was supposed to. So here is the question this story leaves you with, the one worth sitting with a little longer than feels comfortable. Which seat were you in? The last time something like this happened in a room you were standing in? The one being humiliated? The one filming with shaking hands? The one who stayed quiet and told yourself it wasn't your place? Or the one who finally said something 4 minutes too late, but said it anyway? Elijah Marsh got justice because he owned the airline. Most people never will. That is not a comfortable ending, and it is not supposed to be. Dignity should not require a hidden title and a black government phone to be taken seriously. It should be the baseline, every time, for everyone, whether or not anyone with power is watching. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear that they were never invisible to begin with. And leave a comment. Not about the ending, but about the moment before it, the one where everyone in that cabin had to choose whether to look away or look up. I read every single one.